So good morning, everyone who is online. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to what promises to be a very interesting morning. My name is Agnishikha Choudhuri, and I'm a faculty at RVU University School of Design. I'm the program director for interior environments. And today we are going to be discussing exactly that. We have with us a really exciting panel. I'm going to introduce them very shortly. And just before that, I'd like to introduce a little bit of the topic today. We named it Beyond Style and Trends, redefining what's important in interior environments. The reasoning behind this is somewhere looking at the field of interior design. And when we look at it, partly, if you do a Google search, this is what you see. When you say interior design and you do a Google search, this tends to be what we see. There are living rooms or luxurious spaces with a large amount of space and extremely well designed, or rather extremely well curated materials, a lot of luxury, a lot of wealth involved and privilege, it would seem. On the other hand, you don't see much of this. This is a barrier-free tailor shop in Gujarat designed by an architect, Manoj Patel. It's a small 400 square foot space that has been designed to be barrier-free, as well as to work for someone who we don't traditionally think of as deserving of interior design of any sort. And this is what brings up my questions, really. And this is why we have at the RV School of Design decided to relook at our program and question whether interior design as it is taught right now is actually relevant to what we need in the 21st century. So when we look at those things, some of the visions, some of the things we see are missing are this idea of universal design, of inclusion, of understanding diversity, of taking care of the needs of all people as much as possible in spaces, of looking at a certain kind of informed frugality, of not taking materials only as according to one's budget, but rather according to the budget of the environment, so to speak. What can the environment afford? Do we want to have materials that we change with styles and trends? And what happens to those materials? Where do they sit in a landfill for millennia, it would seem? And finally, to look at the idea, and this came about really, I think, for all of us with the lockdown experience, the idea of health and wellness. How do spaces impact how you feel? How do spaces impact how human relationships occur? How do spaces and the way they are configured allow for human beings to breathe healthy air, to not compromise on material experiences, and to live long and not have many doctor visits even in your life? Not just about, living long lives, but what is the quality of the life we live? And I think in some ways, the interior designer's job needs to encompass these. And I would come back with other things I would like to talk about later, and maybe but I think our panelists are really interesting, and I would like to introduce them first. So we have 4 panelists today. We have architect Madhusudhan Chalasani, who is the principal and founder of Studio Made in Hyderabad. Studio Made is an award-winning architectural practice based in Hyderabad, India, and Pamplona, Spain. He's collaborated with a variety of practices in India and worked for 2 years in renowned international practices in Europe before establishing his practice in 2007. The studio believes in a pluralistic approach that is necessary for culture-specific solutions. This means not being driven by a singular guide such as aesthetics or fabrication technology or programmatic innovation, but choosing what needs to work for that context. The practice has been focused on international competitions and self-originated projects that engage the public realm. This interests us a lot, and this is one of the reasons we wanted Mr. Chalasani to be here, because the interiors of public spaces seem to be ignored, and we would have questions about how that happens. One of the latest recognition, I think there's a very long list of recognitions for Studio Made, but the latest I've written down, our Sanchan Art platform is a winner in 2022 in the Korean Spatial Culture Award 2022 in the Republic of South Korea. There are many, many more, but I have omitted them for time purposes. Next, I'd like to introduce architect Natasha I. She graduated from the Academy of Architecture, Mumbai in 1991. She was a part of the core group at Good Earth from 93 and head of the design studio at Good Earth, Bangalore till 2017. A passion for detail, a sense of play defines her approach to work. Creating interfaces between users, designers, craftspersons, and builders, and demystifying the design process is what motivates her. Vernacular architecture, its evolution, innovations, and aesthetics have been an influence on her work and process. Theatre and music are other interests, which she believes are closely connected to understanding and the expression of architectural design. And finally, in 2017, she co-founded a performing arts space called Courtyard Kuta and has been involved in its curation since. We have Dr. Meenu Bhambhani, who is non-traditional in the sense that she is not an architect, but she brings some very important messages to this group. Meenu Bhambhani is the regional head, APAC, and vice president, Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity at State Street. A seasoned professional in the corporate citizenship, diversity, inclusion, and equity space, Meenu has over 2 decades of experience launching, establishing, and executing CSR and diversity strategies in India and APAC. A winner of prestigious awards like the President's National Award, the NCPEDP Helen Keller Award, and alumnus of the International Ford Foundation, Meenu has been recognized nationally and internationally for her contribution and impact created in India in promoting inclusion. In her current role, she is responsible for GIDE consultancy across State Street globally and heading the regional DEI strategy. Prior to joining State Street, Meenu spent over a decade at Emphasis, a global IT conglomerate leading CSR and diversity and inclusion, where she was instrumental in creating path-breaking opportunities that provided high-profile recognition opportunities for their programs, especially around addressing systemic challenges in English literature, a master's in disability and human development from University of Illinois at Chicago. She self-identifies as many intersections of disability, professional, woman, and South Asian origin Indian with a disability. She is a regular speaker in multiple forums, conferences, and workshops, and she has lectured extensively around topics of marginalization and equity. Dr. Anuradha Chatterjee is an Indian-born Australian academic practitioner in architecture and design based in Australia and India. She has over 20 years of experience in research, teaching, and administration, gained through various academic positions in Australia, University of South Wales, University of Sydney, University of Technology Sydney, University of Tasmania, University of South Australia. In China, Zhangjiatong Liverpool University, and India, Manipal University Jaipur, Srishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology, Pearl Academy, and Sushant School of Architecture. But her focus has been on developing critical and research-based pedagogies in studio and history and theory subjects. She has held prominent academic roles in India as Dean, Faculty of Design at Manipal University Jaipur, Dean Academics, Avni Institute of Design, and Head Research and Innovation, Pearl Academy, where she was responsible for institution building, establishing cultures of academic excellence, enhancing internationalization initiatives and research outputs, and driving a high-performance culture based on inclusive and embodied leadership. Dr. Chatterjee has also worked in professional practice in Australia as a senior researcher and heritage advisor at Cracknell Norwegian Architects and guest curator Custom House Sydney. She has an active and diverse research record, and her publications speak to an expansive field of research inquiry. Dr. Chatterjee is regional editor, Asia Pacific Textiles, Cloth and Culture, a registered architect of the Council of Architecture India, and an associate of Australian Institute of Architects. All of you, thank you so much for being here today. There is a diversity in your experiences. There is so many things you bring to this conversation. And I would like first for you to go ahead with what you're going to present, and then we will take the conversation forward with questions and discussion. So could we start with Madhusudhan?
So instead of showing chronologically as projects, I was just thinking that is it possible for me to arrange our work and see if there are inconsistencies through the work and see like, from the frame of the interior, is it possible to distill some kind of an ideas which run through all the projects? So we always start a project with some kind of a independent idea and what you call generic idea, and see like how it adjusts to the context. Then interior also in a way somehow reflects if you are intervening in a historic context or otherwise, how memory plays a role in its. And this is for me is important, like, because interior is always thought as an independent entity, standalone, but for us continuous from as you move from the landscape into the building. So it's a continuity, like, it's not about, it is as much about in between spaces as about the amount that is determined in the older buildings is limited compared to how much, like, programmatically we over determine our spaces, interior spaces, which doesn't allow, like, mutation and like changes in program over a period of time. Like most of them will become redundant spaces over a period of time. So I'll quickly run through the things, and I want you people to see if they may not, all the principles may not be there in all projects, but, like, you will see a certain amount of continuity that runs across the projects. And this is one of the, like, it's a old brick kiln factory which we converted into a space which has no definitive function. People can use whichever way you want. One of the first competitions we won in Portugal. Here, look at that contrast in interior. It's not necessarily you have to decorate an interior. This is actually the interior parts of the space that existed where they used to store the bricks. So we just absolutely cleaned it up and just made it into a raw kind of a space which people could explore. It doesn't have to be a surface application. It doesn't have to be an art add-on thing. That's something you will see in all our projects. It was important because it was a vast context. We had to create some kind of an internal environment which kids can relate. It's as simple as that. So it's a continuity from an external space to an in-between space to maybe a cupboard space to an internal space. It's that spatial continuity that's talked about. And there's nothing, not a single element which is added as an interior element in the project. This is the extension for the World Health Organization, Geneva. Here again, we retain the existing building as it is. And it's more about restructuring the internal spaces. So there are also, like, intermediate spaces where, like, natural light and your perspective of the landscape from there plays an important role in how you perceive the internal spaces eventually. This is a Korean project she was talking about. Here again, minimally intervening and partial experience of how you move from one space to another space into the internal space is all project about. So these intermediate spaces and the natural lights plays such an important role in structuring the internal environment also. It's not about surface application. It's not about using, like, expensive material. It's not about. So when you are talking about public interiors, if you travel anywhere in the West or Australia or America or wherever, so these minimum things are done, and then you don't need a separate interior person working on the public spaces. It's well thought through. This is a case where we had to intervene in a historic building. We had to preserve the building as such. So it's all about how you structure the internal spaces. At all times, keeping the intervention as minimal as we could. So climate also plays such an important role. You see the change in lighting, the degree of lighting, it based upon geographical location of the projects. So you don't have the same kind of ambience in different projects because they're located in geographically different climatic contexts. What I'm trying to say is there is like, you don't treat interior as a standalone entity. It's a continuation of, like, from where you're moving, like a cinematic sequence, like, you move through space. It's not just about, like, a frozen image of an interior space. None of the projects have any interior design as such. It's just the light and the material whatever the basic structural material we use create the ambience. Ambience is not created by anything. This is a school in Switzerland. It's people, it's light which gives the ambience, and not expensive material or in most cases you have everything that is available in the market. You put it in an interior space to make it more expensive. No, how like, each country, this is in Korea, each country is important to find out, like, how light plays an important role in structuring the internal spaces. So now I want you to look at the same principles again and see whether, like, you see any continuity as I'm trying to make this connection.
Thank you so much. That was such a great, interesting set of images. And lots to think about. I have questions, I have thoughts, but I think I'm going to keep those for after everybody is completed.
So just a little bit of context I want to give before I walk you through this presentation. When Dr. Shikha told me about this panel and this program that she's planning, and we had a long chat in the car when we were coming back from IIM Bangalore after that conference, and how we resonated, our thoughts resonated around our homes, around our interiors, which continue to remain non-inclusive of the needs of various sets of people that reside in that home. And I was telling her about my home that we bought it and we renovated it. And I used to live I'm a person with disability. I'm a woman with a disability. I have reduced mobility. So there are certain things that limit me, because of the environment. And so when I was designing my house, I chose an architect who's a renowned architect and all of that. But not many architects continue to keep pace with the changing needs of the generational homes in which we live. So while the basic plan, when it came to us, it was all fine. But when we went through the phase of execution, how everything started changing based on my disability. I used to live in a rented apartment for almost 12 years. So for 12 years, we kept shifting into many apartments within the same complex. So we also knew what has worked and what has not worked for us, and for me especially, because I like to cook also. So I spend a lot of time in the kitchen. I have been a caregiver. So typically people with disabilities are not seen as caregivers. They are seen as care recipients. But I had senior parents from both my husband's side and my mother's side who were bedridden, who needed to be assisted in the daily living activities, and how the interior space is designed either put constraints or it facilitated even the caregiving to become more easy and less of a chore. So here what I have tried to do is show you some pictures of my house. It's not what the pictures that Dr. Shikha showed in the beginning. These are not Instagrammable pictures. These are pictures of a house which we built with a lot of thought, with a lot of functionality, with a lot of focus on functionality, with a lot of focus on access, ease of use, without really compromising on the aesthetics. But aesthetics, like everyone has their own personal sense of aesthetic. So what I may find aesthetic, someone else may not find it that aesthetic. So that would, of course, remain a variable. But we realize that we all live in multi-generational homes. And when we went out to look for an apartment, none of the apartments cater to that need of having people of different generations living in the same, under the same roof. What happens when that happens is that you create exclusionary spaces within those interior environments when you do not provide access and easy functionality through universal design to all the areas of the house. We also tend to forget that eventually we all reach a stage where we do become infirm, and we are constantly battling between the desire to remain independent and the inevitability of interdependence. I will go through the next few pictures. I have put some notes also on those. So I'm starting with the living room. Now, if you see the balcony door here, so you enter the house and this is what you see, the first thing. And there is a living room, there's a balcony there. There was a step before, when we bought this house, there was a step, there was a sliding door. And I knew that my mother, who's now on a wheelchair, will not be able to go to the balcony, get that natural light, natural air, see people, because it's so important for old people to be able to see the community, because they have limited mobility, but they want to see outside spaces and be part of something beyond the four walls. And so I said, you have to remove this and you have to give me a solution where there is no step anywhere. It has to be a seamless entrance to the outside space within that home. And so she came up with this. And of course, I will not know the exact terminologies that the architects use or the interior designers use, that this door can fold up and completely open. And I remember my mother coming and seeing, and from my balcony, you can see children's play area. She used to sit there for hours and just watch people coming and going and seeing children play. The same living room has entrance to the kitchen. Now you see how broad and open the kitchen space is. This is because my mother also likes to cook. And being on a wheelchair, it's not possible for her to get into those smaller spaces. And hence we said we will keep this open. And it's pretty broad. And if she had to turn to the left or to the right, the wheelchair could easily maneuver. So that was the idea behind it, that tomorrow even I could be on a wheelchair. And so I need a space where it's seamless for me. We didn't go for a hob because hob would have meant a higher slab. The height would have increased. And now if somebody's sitting on a wheelchair or on a chair and monitoring cooking, it's not possible for them to be able to see. And also the cylinder space, if you see, so you can close the cupboard and it's not visible, but designed in a very futuristic way that tomorrow, if there is a need, you can remove these and the person can become independent. I'll move to the next. Also, if you see in this kitchen space, everything is pretty much handy. Not too much has been put inside the cupboards so that everything is in the line of sight, whether it's ladles, spoons, ghee, everything is handy. So functionality was kept in mind. And we had a lot of these arguments with the architect that, it won't look nice. It won't look nice. This is not trendy. And we said, this is our home. It's not about following a trend, but it's about making it functional, making it usable, making it livable for a very long time to come, so that tomorrow we don't have to renovate as our body's needs change. Now, if you see, and I want to show you this toilet now. Now, this toilet the bathing area, it has 2 wall niches, one at the lower height, one at a taller height. So now this becomes child friendly as well as friendly to a person who doesn't need that. So, and also for a caregiver. My mother-in-law, she needed assistance with bathing. Now, look at the placement of the shower. It's at a height that is accessible to a child, to a caregiver, and also to the person who's sitting and taking a bath, to a person with disability. So it has been, and this design has been repeated in all the washrooms. I'm just showing sample of one, so that tomorrow you have guests and that bathroom is occupied or something. All of the bathrooms are designed in the same fashion so that it becomes seamless everywhere. Now here, if you see the wash basin, there is no storage below. Again, there was a conscious decision around it that the wheelchair cannot go under the wash basin if there is a storage there. So we have to design it in such a way that she's independent, she can brush her teeth, she can wash her hands, and she can be as independent as possible. Finally, I want to show you the picture of a bedroom. Now, this has mistakes, which sometimes, because I'm not an architect, I feel the architect should have told me that these are the mistakes you're committing. After these mistakes were made and we started using it, we realized, oh my God, this was a mistake. So if you see the placement of the switchboard near the bed, Bangalore weather is such that you need the fan for a couple of hours and you need to switch it off and you need to switch it on. So all night you keep doing that. Now, when you are in a position where you're sleeping, it's too far and too high for the hand to reach and just switch it off like that. Are there standards around it? We don't know. This was one space where no solution could be provided. If you see, this is where I'm sitting and this is the glass door behind. That is what you can see here. This also is my office working space within the home. Now here there's a step to get into the patio or the balcony. Now this place now is only for those who have mobility and who can cross over that. But those who do not have cannot access that space. Now it's a beautiful little space, but then it has created an exclusionary space within that communal space in which we all live. So, and the last picture is, of course, this is my child's bedroom, which also has a balcony. And if you see at the entrance of the balcony door, it's seamless. There are no steps anywhere. Entire house has been designed in such a way that there is seamlessness at the entrance of all the rooms, the bathrooms, the balconies, except where we did not have a choice. And what my observation was in that entire process of 6-7 months of engaging with professionals who did not give us any of these suggestions. It was based on our experience, our need, our use. They were not even aware of the accessibility standards as to at what height certain thing becomes accessible or inaccessible. And they kept saying that this is the general standard. This is the general standard. But that general standard does not apply to a person with a disability. So I think that is where I want to end, and we can ask more questions. Thank you.
I think a little bit, it sounds a bit like bad news for us that you have indicted the community of designers. We shouldn't need specialists for this. Everybody should have this knowledge in the practice. But we will come back to questions shortly. Natasha, would you like to go? Thank you so much. But I think we'll just keep all our questions for the end. And I've got those together because we'd like to hear from all of you.
So, yeah, I too was a bit, thank you for inviting me for this very interesting panel. And yeah, when I spoke with Shikha as well, I was a little confused because I too don't practice interiors. And I have been an architect for most of my life, and have moved to a event, an art space for the last 6 years. So that kind of got me thinking as to what do I feel, what is the role for a future designer, so to speak. So if you look, as Madhusudhan said, that the architect ideally should be completing the design in its entirety, including the interiors, and it should be a seamless idea. But having worked in residential interiors for most of my life, residential buildings and communities for most of my life, I have realized that in the design of communities, when we do, our focus as Good Earth was on designing houses of different kinds, which cater to different users, different categories, different kind of families. And the idea was to put in a kind of create prompts within the space, within the built space, which would encourage people like Meenu to then detail out the design, to then detail out the interiors as they wished, not to have it so-called completed or very aesthetically composed, but more to respond to their life and their needs. And the intent is to kind of accommodate for all these ideas, and also to encourage that level of participation. I think one thing that we found, especially in the design of houses, is that a lot of people want their houses to be done. Like, they want an interior designer to do it. And I see that as a future role, that the interior designer should just be a facilitator. The idea needs to come from the user, and the users need to be empowered, and that becomes a bigger role. And that's what we try to do. Even so, when we design a lot of house types, the idea is to encourage the person to think how do they live and what will be their requirement, and then to make a judicious choice about what kind of house you need. And when we do design the houses, we kind of work out a circulation, allowing for a lot of flexibility, allowing for expression. Because I mean, finally, I think for me, when you kind of detail the interiors, when you inhabit the interiors, it is your personality, and each personality and each requirement is different. So yes, the functionality comes first and the aesthetics go differently. What has happened in the recent past is that we've all become specialists, and there are different, everybody works in their silos. I mean, even if you look at the medical profession or you look at the design profession, there's different people doing different things just for these little compartments, and then who's going to tie that together? So I went through your program document, and I think one of the roles that I see as a future for future designers is to hold this idea together, where the architect is not holding it. It's kind of important that there is a person, there is a designer who is a part of that whole team, who thinks the whole inside as well as the outside through, and thinks from the user's perspective, thinks to the last detail of what would be the height of the chair, where would I keep my keyboard, where would I, maybe my keyboard wants to keep moving. It's not something that needs to be set in stone there. So if you look at public spaces, then there is need for signage, there's need for furniture. If you just imagine our metro stations, if you look at Bangalore and look at the Bangalore metro stations, uh, the spaces are designed perhaps to be efficient, for efficient movement, which is important, but they do lack character in terms of what is the culture that we're trying to impart. Maybe there need to be places to sit. Maybe there needs to be other messages, that it's a vibrant public space, which I feel today, especially in Bangalore, we lose out on that cultural expression, and that the kind of detail, the kind of thoughtfulness as to where maybe somebody needs to stop and sit for a bit because it's such a long walk to reach wherever you need to reach. And can we use those to convey cultural messages, which are not just commercial, but lighter held suggestions of, or hints of what could be. Now, in a public space, I don't know who I mean, it should be the architect. Perhaps the metro stations are designed by engineers. Is there a role for better signage? There's a role for better, these kind of details that need to come into the picture, and who does those? So I would say that we should position the new designers as being in that role where they complete from the graphics to the communication to the navigation to the cultural communication. Ideally, it should be hand in hand with the architect. There should be somebody, and if the architect is not thinking about it, then there needs to be a team or another group that works together and doesn't come in as an add-on, which is what happens very often, that the interior designers come in later. And then, I mean, as an architect, we think that then they want come and they want to break this and redo the whole thing. And ideally, that should have happened right in the beginning. It's also a more intense engagement with the user, which needs to be done, especially in the case of residential interiors. So I think, yeah, that's as far as residential and interiors and how I think about how I think we should position a new kind of idea of a designer. We've moved. So yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot of flexibility that's needed. There's a lot of new ideas that can be put in. So this is a cafe that exists, and it kind of, everything's movable, everything can be redone to suit the purpose of that day. So every day is a new space, and that was one of the briefs that we arrived at when we were designing this. So how do you design something like that, which allows for that flexibility, which allows for that expression, was one of the ideas. The open spaces also kind of go into it. Sometimes minimal intervention helps helps encourage, activity in the outdoors. So this was my first avatar, which I've done for more than 20 years. And about 7 years ago, I moved into designing a performing arts venue or events venue, where working for community, and how do you design spaces that would allow for communities to come and gather and make the space their own. So the design was done in as such that to feel very welcoming, but it's not very structured. Like the books you see keep moving. It's a new display every time. Sometimes it's a big mess. So I think it's very important to not have this very set, like what I think I relate to what Meenu said, that not this set photographic Instagrammable spaces. So this photo might look a bit Instagrammable because we do need to market, but at any given time, it doesn't look like that. It's used, it's books are all over the place, kids are on the floor, people are sitting and sticking some paper or taking on a project, and that's how it should be. So I think I designed the space thinking about the different uses of the same space, using the same kind of furniture, and how do you imagine different uses for it and encourage even the artists to come and use it differently. So this is the same space that kind of gets a different look depending on the need. This is another space that becomes a workshop when we need it. It's a library nook. This is created by children when they're doing a sort of a project, so they're building a fort for themselves, and the space allows for that. It's got very minimal furniture. It became a sari museum walk for one of the events, and it becomes the same space, becomes using the same furniture, becomes a eating event, a food event where you're telling stories and you're also eating. So it kind of allows, and this is an exhibition space. So it kind of allows for different uses, using maybe just 10 platforms and 10 easels, and that's all. So how minimal can we be, and how can we use the same space in different ways? So I think I see that even if we need to expand the scope of what designers should do, I think we're talking about designing of experiences. And so you're not just designing the space per se in the typical sense of being an architect or being a interior designer, where you do furniture and where you do objects, or you do products, or you do graphics. But I think it encompasses all of that, and maybe in an interior given space, and how do you design an experience depending on the context, depending on the program, maybe how you even design the program. So a lot of these kind of, if you see this, the sari walk, we designed a textile themed show where we had a sari walk in this space, and then we had weaving workshops, and we had a fashion show, and so we used the same space, which kept changing. So even the design of the program was thought through with the space. It's not that the program came separate from the space. We used the idea of the program responding to our spaces, and they went hand in hand. And I think that's the role of a designer as well, you know. So yeah, I think I'll stop there and we can go into the discussion.
Thank you so much, Natasha. That was really interesting. And I think so far, each of you has had something specific to say that I'm going to, come upon later. Dr. Anuradha, you're last. Would you like to go ahead?
You all can see my presentation, yeah?
Yes.
Fantastic. So thank you so much. I think I'm happy to be the last sort of speaker on this panel, because I think my colleagues have made such amazing points about the program that we are launching here. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of touching upon some of the things that the speakers today have already talked about, but maybe from a much more theoretical and introspective point of view. I want to talk a little bit about the idea of myth and memory. So I think there are four, apart from the idea that interiors have to function and they have to, I suppose, the aesthetics behind it. I think what I wanted to focus on in this part of the talk is about four aspects. Is this idea of myth, mythology, memory, history as one, then place and meaning as another, and the idea of event and performance as a third, and the fourth as being, this idea of sort of well-being, refuge, and safety, which a lot of you have already talked about. What I'm doing is, and I think the point is made really well by all the speakers, that somehow you kind of find yourself as almost like reluctant interior designers, in the sense that you're not interior designers, but the designers of interior environments, or the way you kind of fashion them anyway. I want to just show and maybe think through what these interiors mean, focusing specifically on what it means to inhabit some of these environments and what they mean. Well, beyond their Instagrammable, the point Meenu made was fantastic, because so much of interior practice is imagistic and image driven. So I just, I was just looking at some of the interiors. Literally, I was in this space 2 days ago doing this conference in Rome, and this is an interior of because I think I just want to talk a little bit about a lot of these trends in interiors that are about creating false sense of history, of this whole idea of stylism and stylistic. And I just want to, also have the attendees today appreciate the gravity that really comes, and the authenticity that comes with being in historic interiors. And this was one of the conference spaces, one of the large halls in a palazzo in Rome, which was a venue for the conference. So it's and how that, and why that space, and maybe just think about why that is an appropriate setting for an academic conference or a discussion. So I'm just kind of not really giving any directives, but maybe just thinking together with colleagues here and with attendees why this would be an interesting space to have an academic conference. Pursuing this idea of myth, memory, and heritage history a bit further. This is a hotel in Sydney, and I went there about a month ago. And again, this whole ideas of how you work with old and new materials, and we are really there focusing on this idea of an aesthetics that comes out of how you reconcile the new with the old. And so over and above, I suppose, the stylism or the imagistic approach to design, I think the thinking is really about, and I think the point that Natasha made about designing an experience, and I think that really goes to the core of some of these projects, I think. When we look at an interior of an art gallery, this is the interior of the older wing of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, where this photo was taken again last month, where I visited the Kandinsky exhibition. And you think, well, you know, again, this brings back to Madhusudhan's presentation about the fact that your architecture and your interior is in continuum. It's not that you build a shell and then you kind of just insert an interior into it, but that somehow there's a continuum between the structure, the interior, and the outside. And here is, well, I mean, in terms of when you think about why this would be an interesting place to have an exhibition, and you think about the fact that art galleries are places, are public interiors that, and you see yourself, and the point is that, you know, that others also see you participating in a public act of engaging in a cultural activity. So these kinds of spaces are kind of designed specifically keeping those kinds of activities in mind. And I think this is an interesting counterpoint, because I'll show you the new wing of the art gallery, which is completely different to this. This is so much focused on this idea of looking inwards. So interiors, you know, the idea of interiority, that even as human beings, we also have interiorities, and, you know, so we're inward looking as well as outward looking. And some buildings, some interiors can be more inward looking than outward looking. I really think it kind of responds to the idea of purpose. If you look at the new wing, which is a Sydney Modern, which is adjacent to the previous space that I just looked at, this is an interior without an interior, and because this really throws you out, it really kind of focuses your eye outside. That one point perspective that you saw in the previous image is not there. There are many points. This is much more distracted. So I would call this an interior of distraction, or an interiority of distraction, because there is not one vantage point that you can look at. So you're really literally thrown out of the building in this space. This was a space we recently went to for a colleague's farewell party, and you know, these kind of spaces are designed specifically for things to happen. You know, these are performative spaces, so not just people are performing in these spaces, but the space is performing something for you, and it tells you that something is going to happen. So this idea of the event, that the life that you lead in these interiors are events. So adding on to this idea of experience, but they're also events, that things happen. And so when you look at something like this, and straight away it tells you that something is going to happen, or something quite social or convivial is going to happen. So again, I'm not making a kind of a judgment. It's not a kind of a thing that this is good or bad, but just that there are different ways in which interiors are designed, kind of theorizing it. This is a much beloved space in our university. It's called the Sketching Studio in the SDI block. It's one of the spaces where, again, it's a space of collaboration, of something happening. It's not overtly designed or, really kind of articulated in terms of an interior, but it's an interior where things happen. It's not a static space. It's by the virtue of the space that it is, it's an active space where a lot of things happen, especially collaboration. Again, we looked at, this is an interior from Chiba University, where I went for a conference last year. And again, this whole idea of what does it mean? You know, the kind of textures, they're not arbitrary random choices. Again, this idea of aesthetics, what does it mean? What does it mean to have exposed structure, exposed surfaces? It's a very specific aesthetics. And again, if you have a large span space where you have this broader, kind of spaces of collaboration, multifunctional spaces, is that something that is aiding that thing to happen? So again, we're thinking of not function per se, but things that happen, events, and not events in the sense of functions, but events in terms of what people do together as an event. So, I'm just thinking about whether something like this aids that kind of collaboration. A lot of people have talked about the Bangalore airport interiors. And again, I'm kind of torn on, I'm not kind of undecided on the fence, because so much of it, again, is becoming very imagistic to me, because airports have very different problems, especially as far as it concerns issues of access and disability and designing for people who are neurodivergent. This really tells me that this is a single dimensional approach to this idea of well-being. But I just wanted to put it out there and think through, what this might mean to others. But it's definitely becoming something of a brand even. So I'm just thinking that when interiors start to become brands, and what does that mean for that interior, right? This is a much more humble space, which is a co-working space where we all went from our school for a day-long retreat. And it was such a beautiful, such a small, such a cleverly designed space. And, it really worked for us to kind of just sit there all day. These are spaces that I remember. There's a memorability to it because of, the kind of work that you were doing again. So as you can see, a space of action. It's not a static space, which is just for photographing. And that I thought was also an interestingly designed interior in Bangalore International Center, which we've recently been to. And that's my home. It looks still doesn't look very lived in, because I've only lived here for 6 months. And so it looks very, but then again, that photograph on the right was taken when I was lying on my sofa and the light was shining through. So again, these ideas of meaning, that the point that Meenu's talk so beautifully made about the kind of personal attachment to the place itself. I think that's really, really important. And this is one of our classrooms. And then again, we can think about whether it has an interior or it needs an interior. And some of the issues about, I think I just wanted to touch upon with the learning space is that we, because I actually used one of these classrooms for my mental health by design elective, the kind of feedback we got on the redesign of this classroom was all to do with, where the entry is and where the glare is coming from. And, it's all about focus, and it's, it's about, who is moving around where. So I think I want to come back to these ideas that I started the talk with initially, was this idea of myth memory. So the fact that past history, gravity, memorability is important. I think we need that, but I think it's very difficult to manufacture that through stylistic and stylism and adding on artifice. But I think every place has meaning. There's a sense of place, and it's to do with personal, social, and collective. And it is to do with being attachments, personal and social and collective attachments. I think that's important for interiors. And as designers, I think we contribute to making places and spaces that do that. I think all interiors are places where something happens. There's an event or a performance in terms of not a function, like I said, but the fact that, your human life unfolds, the everyday unfolds as an event, and people and space perform. So the interior is kind of a stage. And the final point I wanted to talk about was well-being, refuge, and safety, whether the space provides for yourself, whether it provides a space for your mental, physical, and emotional health. And I think over and above what interior designers think they need to do more of this stuff, I think. So more than image, and that's really what I wanted to close with, this idea that, and I think all our speakers have talked about this idea of, that kind of the interiors is not really an image. And of course, that visual perception is important, but I think we work all, because it's kind of in a multi-sensory way with interiors. And I think going back to the images that Shikha opened the talk with, and I really think that what we are trying to do as a school is move away from that much more shallow, productive, and much more outdated practice, I think, of teaching interior design in that way. So with that, I'll end my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anuradha. That was one whole nother dimension from all of the other speakers. It's been great listening to each of you, and we have used a lot of time. So I'm going to get right into a couple of questions. I think my first question would be for Madhusudhan, because of all the presentations, I think yours, the scale is something else in yours. And I was just wondering, in terms of scale, one of the things you've talked about is the public exterior or the public enclosure. How does one handle the experience of human scale in these spaces? How do you humanize scale? Or is it because it's only transitional, so people should feel it but move through it? How do they experience comfort in that scale?
I think it's very difficult to answer it. To understand the issues Anuradha spoke, or all the others two speakers spoke about, is one aspect of it. It's extremely difficult as an all-inclusive way of looking at things and actually doing it at scales of public scales, like, rather than the domestic scales. I really don't know whether one can pre-think about all these things and do, or your understanding automatically converts when you start drawing it, when you start making it, automatically it gets translated. I don't know. It's very difficult. Look, none of the aspects which Anuradha spoke or rest of the other speakers speak are there in our mind when we are doing the work. They are there at the background, definitely, but it's not something which are consciously applied as such. So, for example, Anuradha was talking about the plaza which hosted one of the event spaces. This is something image which always stuck to me was, why are our older buildings as a background seems to function better than our modern shells we make as architecture, and then we need to do superficial additions to it to convert into some kind of an additional add-on as a thing. So if your preconception of a backstage itself is adequate, then you don't need to do anything else.
Perhaps what you're saying is also the part that Natasha talked about, which is that you allow people to inhabit their space and
so that's what I was coming to. You don't over-determine spaces. You allow, because it's impossible for anyone to envisage all kinds of scenarios how public spaces are going to be used. For example, the events are going to be different. The way they are going to be occupied is going to be different. So how does one do it? At least like from my experience, is by determining less and less and less possible. You only determine a certain sequence, you determine a certain scale, and determine the background structure in a way that which allows it to mutate and change over a period of time. Something which Natasha was talking about, very difficult to do it at a domestic scale. And because domestic spaces also are more personalized than, say, public spaces. So how does one do it? Even there, I feel that one could structure in a way that you minimally determine it in a way that which allows for multiple interpretation and a multiple way of looking at things at a later stage. It's impossible for any designer sitting on a drawing table to determine all kinds of possible ways space could be looked at. But what is important? What is important is, how do you treat light? How do you sequence spaces? What kind of perspective you get from a certain vantage point? So these are the things which are in our control. But what is not in my control is how eventually it is going to be occupied and used. But I need to have a certain sense of what events will take place, what kind of density of people will move through the space, and then design accordingly. it's impossible for anyone to pinpointly and over determine it and say, okay, this is how I'm going to do it, and people are going to use it that way. And I feel the reason why, without being conscious about this idea of whatever we all spoke today, the older buildings seems to respond it better because they were determined less and less. They were determined more from the aesthetic perspective and the constructive perspective, and less about stylized way of doing things.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Natasha, would you like to speak?
Yeah.
Would you like
Yeah.
to respond?
Yeah. So I think I'd like to add to that, Madhusudhan, that I think it's more in the programming that when you have these large public spaces, if there is an intent for community to own it, I think the reason why the older buildings, a lot of the older buildings are more relevant is because they are owned by community. And community takes responsibility for what happens there, and they are sensitive to how it can be used. So I think it's in the designing of the program. Maybe it unfortunately becomes out of the purview of the architect who's given a brief. But I think somewhere we need to think as designers to extend that brief and to push for the brief to be more detailed, and how will communities take more ownership of these spaces and responsibility. So how do you design for that? I think that's the bigger challenge, which somehow, at least in India, it doesn't come under the purview of the architect. So which is, I think, which is what should change, and which is what the new designers should be a part of. It's not about an architect doing it. It's not these fragments, but somebody needs to think about it holistically. You need to plan for the programs that will happen. How will these places, how can they be used? We have to stretch that imagination of the brief of that space. Yeah.
See, what happens as a contrast to this is, like, you look at some of the palaces which were essentially privately owned estates. They mutated into, like, these luxury hotels better than perhaps any modern buildings could do it. You travel across Italy, each and every hotel, even at different scales, like, they were able to transform those buildings into new contemporary purposes, precisely because there was an aesthetic background that was set, and which allowed people to change its usage over a period of time. What modern architecture are like, our obsession with program and linking structuring of the spaces as per the eventual usage has completely destroyed this idea of creating something which is a more of a spatial experience and less of a programmatic utility. And that is, like, for example, in these competitions, we were able to do at a certain scale because, like, they give us that, as you suggested, they give us the extra leverage to, like, allow us to reprogram it, or kind of, like, even suggest some spaces which may not have any specific purpose other than experiential purpose. But what happens when it's a private driven project? So, like, with our limited budget, like, all the money goes into showing off what you want it to be, rather than how eventually, like, people are going to use it over a period of time. And since it's a pedagogical, like, mostly the audience are students, I wanted you people to reflect upon how do you see understanding, identifying these values is one thing. How do you actually make students sensitive without throwing the idea of a design under the bus? Because I also see the other contrast where, like, so much of social thing is spoken about, the actual like, design goes under the bus. Nobody, like, it's just random stuff thrown at us and saying that, okay, this is community decided, so it's not necessarily the community that decides like what is right and what is, like, not right. So some balance need to be struck. Somehow in India, the practices seems to swing either from a complete autonomy and doing their own way because they can afford it, to the other extreme of, like, over engaging the social aspect of it and completely throwing the design. So people are confused. People don't know what to choose, actually.
I'd just like to, I want to bring it back to what Dr. Meenu has said, because some of the time that is the struggle. People do not want to do the things that people need first. And this is also a struggle in the interior design profession, which is, oh, if I make it universally accessible, it's going to be so boring. And we already have this preconception. Dr. Meenu, what you said and what you showed us and what you talked about tells us clearly there's huge amount of training required in universal access. And I'm thinking about access as a right rather than some kind of charity framework. How do you think we could move forward then?
I mean, I wouldn't have the answer to that question, Shikha, but I can share from my experience. It takes work. It takes work to convince people. And sometimes I feel, I'll give you an example that I don't know how many of you have visited Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore, MAP. Now, MAP comparatively is one of the most accessible and inclusive museums in the country. Now it's a public space. And this was a project, which was my last project when I was working with Emphasis. And how much advocacy I had to do to push for supporting an initiative like that from an accessibility perspective, where I heard thoughts from leaders and the advisory board members that people with disabilities they need accessible infrastructure in terms of buses, airports, railway stations. They need education, they need jobs, but why an art space? Why do we need to invest in that? And I said, because you don't think that people with disabilities can be mothers with disabilities, can be fathers with disabilities, can be grandparents with disabilities, can be children with disabilities. You do not include them in public spaces. You make them invisible. They are unheard. They are unseen. And the need to include them is never there. Never there. So I said, I face exclusion on a daily basis. When my child was small and she was invited for birthday parties and all these indoor gyms, again, public spaces. There were no lifts, there were no elevators, or there were only escalators. I couldn't take her to those places. So I was excluded, so I became invisible, and resulting in my child also becoming invisible and not being part of the community. So, I mean, so many students are here. Sometimes those who are spending money, they don't want to think about these things because they're only thinking about aesthetics and design and a certain quote unquote type of community. And I think that is where one needs to broaden one's thinking, that your audience will keep changing. It is not going to remain static at that young age group as well. And you have to look at it from the context of India as well, where, as I said, that we live in multi-generational homes and families, and somewhere this has to either come through standards. We have harmonized guidelines, but again, these are guidelines and not mandatory. So how do we push for some of these mandates to happen in those designs so that, certain populations do not become invisible?
Thank you.
I wanted to echo Meenu's point about why people with disability should be included in public spaces of art. I would have given a shorter answer. It's called democracy. That's part of living in a democratic society, and that all individuals have exactly the same access rights. And I think your point you have picked up so well in terms of, but also just touching upon that. There's a lot of design, accessible design that's being done in India even now, that's focused entirely on physical disability, to even understand the entire spectrum of disability, And how do you design art spaces for people who are not just physically disabled, but they may have other forms of disability, hearing disability or visual impairment. There's just generally that understanding is not there. And I think you've touched upon something that's very close to my heart, this idea of art spaces and why they should be accessible. So thank you for that. So, sorry, Professor Shikha, you were saying something.
I wanted you exactly to add to it, but I was also thinking from this point of view of what you said today, how, in some ways it's about meaning making, looking at the idea of access. We have certain meanings in place about what looks good and what doesn't. Can we engage in myth making to shift these narratives? So we spatially configure myths and meaning and make memory out of spaces. And a lot of what Madhusudhan was talking about also, why do older places have it? They have some forms of ornamentation or direction or scale or movement that allows us to kind of be engaged with them, where often our modernist blocks don't. We have to inhabit them. We have to do something to them. Even the image you showed of our classroom, I mean, it looked best because it had an exhibition in it. Otherwise, seeing it without that makes it really unpleasant.
Yeah. Mm.
So
I think maybe the answer is building with love, building the interiors you care, and you stay with them. And I think, Professor Shikha, you've touched upon this, I think, in our conversations, that you are not. It's not that you're not producing tomorrow's designers who kind of engage in this kind of relentless movement of putting in interiors, pulling them out, putting in interiors, pulling them out, but you're kind of thinking about building spaces that you love, or with love and care, I think, which is what Madhusudhan's talk, it touched upon a lot of that. It's just done just so it's not careless or thoughtless or loveless. I don't know what it is, but yeah.
Is it also something to do with our materiality and our material texture? This idea of wanting it all to be glossy and white or clean looking versus allowing it to develop patinas, allowing it to look old, allowing it to develop that kind of thing that maybe is not considered pristine, but it develops character. And the interiors, especially because of our notions of how cleanliness should look, we accept it in an older building, we accept fading, but we do not accept it in newer looking constructions. Perhaps that makes a difference as well. We're out of time, and I think it's been really interesting. I think what we're going to say is that this has to be the first of many. There is much more to talk about here. Thank you so much, Olpi. I'm going to end with something. So I think one of the things we need would be some form of accreditation or some kind of standard for somebody like Meenu to be able to go and accept that a designer would take care of her needs and know what they needed to know. That would be important. And this is the definition of interior design by the Council for Interior Design Qualification in the US. And it says, qualified by means of education, experience, and examination, interior designers have a moral and ethical responsibility to protect consumers and occupants through the design of code-compliant, accessible, and inclusive interior environments that address well-being, while considering the complex physical, mental, and emotional needs of people. I mean, it kind of takes care of a lot of the things we're talking about today. So perhaps we need a standard. The Council of Architects has been there to make sure that architects come out with a certain base level of training. Maybe and one of the things interior design suffers from is this lack of legitimacy. Like, who are we? Where do we go? We are neither architects nor stylists. We keep saying, no, it's not interior decoration. That's not what we do. And I think this has to shift. And perhaps accreditation is one of the ways to go. And with that, I mean, I would like to ask, anybody has any last words? Otherwise, we are out of time.
Yeah, I see. I think what Anuradha said, everybody, if they do whatever they do with care and and love, I think it will be fine.
So we got to
learn. Everybody will learn.
We're going to teach that also, how to design with love.
Yeah, you do that, and that's it. I think students will learn. It's not that everybody will understand everything in one go. If they constantly be very conscious about it and then they work with care and love, I think it will be perfectly fine. Things will improve over time. Okay.
So much. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you
Thank
for your
you.
Thank you,
It
everyone.
was such a pleasure meeting all of you and listening.
Yeah, it was a
Yeah.
real pleasure. It was a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Shikha. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.